I came from fine art and a painting background, and I was making abstract paintings. So I didn't do narrative films. My idea was to make sort of experimental, small artist films initially. And that changed when I went to the film school because of who I met there, really, and who was teaching there at the time. So people like Steve Dwoskin, Peter Goodall, and then Noel Birch came and gave us weekly seminars, and we basically went through the history of film from silent film in those Monday seminars, looking actually at the films themselves and talking about them. So it was a very sort of rich period. And then outside that were all the, like the arts lab that I used to go to, the UFO club, all the things that were going on at that period from, I suppose, the late 60s through into the 70s. So there was a lot of experimentation in all forms of art. And I felt very centrally part of that. The Royal College, when I first went there, it was like a turning point, really. There were 3 women and 17 men in my class when I went there, and this was my going there coincided with the course being led by Stuart Hood. And Stuart Hood was very innovative. He come from the BBC. I think he was controller of BBC Two. And he was very sympathetic to the sort of things that we wanted to do to change things. So we managed to get equal number of women coming in. So the following year, after I had been there, so there'd been 3 of us women in the first year. The next year down, it was 50-50. And students were also represented on the interview panels. So we were making some kind of changes. So I think because there was that going on and all these experimental filmmakers coming in to teach, brought in, I guess, by Stuart, the beginning, the genesis, if you like, of the Independent Filmmakers Association began because of the Royal College of Art. The history of filmmaking was from the Lumiere brothers onwards, and we were looking at experimental work like Peter Gabelka and all that kind of experimental stuff that was coming out of America and Europe. So there wasn't really that much happening at that time in Britain, apart from, the co-op, the London Filmmakers Co-op, which had been set up, and there was a kind of anti-narrative, structuralist beginnings in Britain, which I think was probably led by Americans. So people like Steve Dwoskin was American, Peter Goodall was American, and then the other, I suppose, leading figure was Malcolm le Grice. So they were kind of, Malcolm le Grice was at St Martin's. So I guess there was an impetus more to be looking at non-narrative experimental work at that point in time, and that was what influenced us initially at the Royal College. It was a time of political change, and we were still very much affected by the events of 1968 and everything that had gone on. Most of us had probably been on the demonstrations against America's involvement in Vietnam. I certainly went, although I wasn't particularly political at the time. I think bringing in Noel Birch, who was a Marxist, was obviously decided by Stuart Hood. And he was responsible in his way of looking at film for changing my political outlook. I was completely apolitical when I went, even though I'd been on these demonstrations. I think we were very much into European film rather than the sort of activist film of the time. That was just the students, because we were all into this theory. So, and we had Peter Goodall, who obviously had his own thing about structuralism, who was completely anti-narrative. And then we had Steve Dwoskin. And in some ways it was probably quite elitist, because not that many, you know, it was quite, it was privileged to go to art school and to go to the Royal College of Art. It was very hard to get into, and it was seen as the pinnacle of like education at that point for artists. We did get involved in activism because I made a film about Trico. It was 1975 or 6, I'm not too sure, but there was a factory making windscreen wipers for cars in West London, and this was a bit after the Ford strike. I think it's not as well known as that one. And they went on strike for equal pay, so they were on strike for quite a few weeks, I think. And we supported it. Myself and another student, we made a film about it. So it was around that time that I began to think that I should be making films that were more activist, and collectives were beginning to develop through the Independent Filmmakers Association and so on. So there was a move towards making more activist and more, you know, politically engaged films. Experimental type filmmakers weren't able to get work because they couldn't get into the union, which was operating a closed shop at the time. So you couldn't get into the union unless you had a job, and you couldn't get a job unless you were in the union. And you really had to be sponsored by somebody. And that sponsorship of somebody who was already in the union would kind of get through that catch-22 situation. So because of that, it was very hard. You couldn't find funding. You couldn't really work to make films either in the industry or outside it without being a kind of artisan, you know, like using the film co-op and so on. And, you know, developing film yourself. And film was still expensive in those days. It was still hard. So equipment was expensive. You couldn't, like today with a video camera, you can get a small video camera, you can make films, you can put them on YouTube. In those days, you couldn't. The IFA really came out of anger at not, you know, the way our work was being treated, that it was felt as not legitimate, that it wasn't proper filmmaking, and that we didn't validate being shown on television. And we couldn't get funding, and we couldn't go into the union. So it was like we were completely marginalised. And at that point, perhaps because it was a different era and people were beginning to feel that change was coming and people were much more political than they are now, they got together and established the Independent Filmmakers Association, which was a very important initiative. Because from that, they set up groups that weren't based just in London. It was all over Britain. People started to work collectively, and people started to use their collective muscle to make and get changes. So the IFA, it wasn't going for very long, really, but during that period, they were able to get funding from all sorts of sources, including the British Film Institute, to get their films shown on television, and importantly to be able to work in the industry if they wanted to, because they got an agreement with the union, the film union. The next thing that happened in 1982, I think it was, Channel 4 was established, and they had the Independent Film and Video Department. It coincided with Thatcher coming in. So Thatcher came in 1980, and the idea was to be able to have independent producers, which was the idea of privatisation, really, of television. So against the BBC, really. But there were no independent producers yet. And so in a sense, all there was us. All there was independent filmmakers who were making completely experimental and activist type films. And Channel 4 had no advertising when it was set up in 1982. It was funded by ITV, I think. And it wasn't supposed to be a competitor, so it was like a public thing that wasn't private, that had this remit to be innovative. And innovative in those days was completely different to what's innovative now. If you look at the content of Channel 4 as it is today, it was a very different kind of innovation. And that film and video department that was set up was led by Alan Fountain, who himself had been an independent filmmaker, and Rod Stoneman, who was part of the IFA, and Caroline Spry. So those people were not only supposed to have a remit to set up and nurture the independent film movement, but they themselves had been part of it. And I still call myself an independent filmmaker in the sense that I'm in opposition to, I see myself as being in opposition to the mainstream film industry and television, political and aesthetic, because in those days that was much clearer, because you didn't have any form of independence except to be in opposition, really, because you wouldn't be able, I mean, of course there were amateur filmmakers and there were film societies and people making films, and in some ways, you know, our artisan approach to making films and everybody having to have another job in order to survive. But I mean, that's a traditional thing of artists, that you teach or you do something else to support yourself while you're making your work. Film is much more expensive than that, so not being able to get access to funding was a big problem to being able to work at all. And that was the difficulty, but you couldn't, like now, people make work and they stick it on YouTube, but that doesn't mean that they're an independent filmmaker in the sense that I'm talking about, because they're not politicised. Well, they may be political, but they're not. There is no sense at the moment, or hasn't been for a very long time, that there are people out there who not only make work independently, but also are politically engaged with trying to get access to mainstream, or to change the way mainstream television or the film industry is set up. There's a kind of acceptance now that it's sort of out there. There are people who may want to get into it, but they want to get into it as the same as it is, not to get in to change it. And then there are people who just make these very small scale films, and everybody is like on their own. So there's no collectivity, and it's that I think is the biggest difficulty. Because if, in an ideal world, if I was able to have the type of culture of filmmaking that would be ideal for me, would be to work with other people, supporting each other. So you wouldn't necessarily make films always that you would want to make, but you know, you have that benefit of working collaboratively, and that doesn't really seem to be the case. But then, you know, I mean, how would that work? You know, it's a whole new game, and you'd have to start from scratch, I think. You couldn't use the model of the IFA now. So, for example, there's the Radical Film Network. I gather that they are discussing, well, what do we mean by radical? So they're using that term, and they seem to be making political films generally. But is that to do with aesthetic concerns as well. So there's a discussion beginning to take place. But I certainly don't think you can go back and say, right, everything was like that in the 70s and 80s, and we can do the same today, because the situation today is totally different.